Okay, will you let everyone in from the waiting room?
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning, everyone. I see everyone is joining now. We'll just give it a few seconds while everyone connects to their audio. But in the meantime, I'd like to introduce myself and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Tebohole Kubu from the Southern African Liaison Office, and I'd like to welcome you all to SALO's virtual public dialogue, tracking recent developments in Zimbabwe. You'll notice that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed. Today's session is public, and as always, if you have any questions about this meeting, please feel free to email us at info@salo.org.za. I'll also drop the email in the chat afterwards. Please can everyone keep themselves muted. So today's dialogue provides a platform to discuss the continued deepening democratic challenges in Zimbabwe, particularly the risk posed by Agenda 2030 and the PVO Amendment Bill. Our goal today is to strengthen regional advocacy for stability, support human rights efforts, and encourage regional solidarity. We hope for a robust discussion on these issues and a deeper look at the likelihood of Agenda 2030 and the PVO bill coming into passing. We are honored today to have five distinguished speakers joining us. Blessing Vava, the Regional Director of the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, Tatenda Wachenuka, the Programs and Movement Lead at We Lead Trust, Beloved Chiweshe, the Deputy Director at Accountability Lab Zimbabwe, Dr. William Jethro Mpofu from the Wits Center for Diversity Studies, and Gift Ostalos Siziba, who is a former MP for the Citizens Coalition for Change. Today's session will be chaired by Professor Brian Raftopoulos, who will also provide more context for today's meeting. He's a SALO board member and a leading Zimbabwean scholar and activist. The first part will be for the speakers to give their presentations. Following that, in the second session, we'll open up the discussions to the floor. So please prepare your questions and contributions after the speakers are presented. Once again, as this meeting is public, and to avoid any unnecessary interruptions, the video and audio functions have temporarily been disabled. So for each of the speakers, once it is your turn, one of the Zoom hosts will prompt you to unmute yourself and turn on your video. So please just be aware, look on the lookout for that. And then during the question and answer session, please use the raise hand function if you want to contribute to the chat or to the conversation, to the discussion. And the chair will acknowledge you. And then once again, as well, you can also contribute in the chat. For those who have not, please ensure that your name and surname are also displayed on the screen, or identify yourself when you make your contributions. And as always, we appreciate the expertise provided by Prof. Raftopoulos, as well as the excellent work by Lily, who is our dialogues manager in organizing these sessions. Without wasting too much of your time, and on behalf of SALO, and in collaboration with the Norwegian People's Aid, I would like to thank everyone here for joining us today. Over to you, Prof.
Thanks, Teboho. And once again, thank you to SALO for this continuing dialogue. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us, and particularly welcome to the speakers who have agreed to present their thoughts on this new iteration of a continuing Zimbabwe crisis. Just to provide some context before we start, since President Mnangagwa took over the reins of power in 2017 through the coup, he has moved to consolidate his power in the face of the simmering factional battles within the ruling party. Mnangagwa's move for a third presidential term has deepened these tensions in the ruling party, as well as more broadly within the citizenry. At ZANU-PF's 21st National People's Congress in October 2024, the first two of its 162 resolutions pointed to both Mnangagwa's move for a third presidential term and the further conflation of party state rule. The first resolution was the President and First Secretary of ZANU-PF, His Excellency E.D. Mnangagwa's term of office as President of the Republic of Zimbabwe and First Secretary of ZANU PF be extended beyond 2028 to 2030. The party and government should therefore set in motion the necessary amendments to the national constitution. Secondly, the party and government should establish a comprehensive framework that ensures the operationalization of the principle of party supremacy over the government. However, for the 2030 agenda to take place, the following legal steps would have to be followed. First, a bill amending both Section 91 and Section 328(7) of the Constitution would have to be published in the Gazette for at least 90 days. Secondly, Parliament would have to invite public comments, both written and verbal, on the proposed amendments. Third, the bill would have to be passed by 2/3 majority at its final readings in both the Assembly and the Senate. And last, within 3 months, the bill would have to be put to a referendum and passed by a majority of voters who cast their votes. That's the legal procedures. Now, we can't rule out how this could be overthrown. The central problem for ZANU-PF is that Mnangagwa's extended term project is being challenged by war veterans and sections of the military loyal to Mnangagwa's presidential challenger, General Chiwenga. In January 2025, a leader of one of the key factions of the War Veterans Association, Blessed Gaza, and fellow war veterans threw down a gauntlet against Mnangagwa's attempt at the third-term presidency. In Geza's words, it is clear that Mnangagwa has failed. He is not fit to run this country and his time to go is now. We ask him to go peacefully. If he refuses to take heed of this advice, we have no option but to ask the people of Zimbabwe to deal with a rogue president in line with the constitution. Emmerson Mnangagwa, on assumption of power, showed that he was a man who had learned nothing. Instead of correcting the mistakes of Robert Mugabe, he went about proving to all of us that Mugabe was a saint. Interestingly, this warning from the war veterans drew on both the restore the legacy message that was used to remove Mugabe in 27 coup and the constitutionalist narrative of the political and civic opposition since the late 1990s. In early 2025, a senior war veteran, Blessed Geza, called for mass protests on the 31st of March to oppose Mnangagwa's 2030 project. Geza has been charged with treason but has eluded capture. The call for protests turned out to be a mass tearaway, with only a few protests in Harare and Bulawayo, which were quickly closed down by the police. Protesters were arrested, and as is the usual protocol for ZANU-PF. The questions that come out of this context are a few. One, was the stay away a victory for Geza and his supporters in the ruling party? Two, why did the citizenry choose to stay away? Was it a combination of fear and support for the removal of Mnangagwa? Is there a broad cynicism that this is just the latest iteration of an internal battle within ZANU-PF, which will once again result in further resurgence of authoritarian rule by the ruling party? Thirdly, could this be a revised version of the 27 coup, the result of persistent internal factionalism in the ruling party? And lastly, how was the systematic dismantling of the opposition as a result of a combination of state repression and infiltration and strategic mistakes by the leadership of the opposition itself resulted in the form in which this latest protest has been constructed? Those are my introductory remarks, and I'm putting these questions to the speakers. They are, of course, at will to expand that or to concentrate on other issues. But let me now hand over to the first speaker, Blessing Vava, Director of the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition. Over to you, Blessing.
Thank you, Prof. I was struggling to unmute. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
All right. First, I think I wish to extend my gratitude to SALO for inviting me for us to have a discussion regarding the political developments in Zimbabwe, which are moving at a very, very alarming rate. So my presentation will be organized in Video, okay. Yeah, sorry about that. I was saying my presentation is organized in 3 parts, which firstly, I'll just give a brief of an overview of what is currently obtaining in the country. I will also give a brief on what has happened, what has reached us this far. I will also touch on the PVO bill, which in my view, I think it has largely been overtaken by more pressing developments in the country, and it may not be of substantial relevance as we move forward, but I'll go into detail as I conclude my presentation and also give a way forward. So my main thrust of my discussion is to illuminate the factors that contributed or that are contributing to democratic regression in our country, mainly being triggered by the 2030 agenda and the ongoing succession bet within ZANU-PF. Our country now is embroiled in a contentious succession struggle between President Emerson Mnangagwa and his deputy Constantino Chiwenga, in a typical, notion which was put by Professor Masipula Stole, the struggles within a struggle, the political dynamics that are unfolding. I think that they are emanating from the unfinished business of the November 2017 coup that removed Robert Mugabe from power. And I think that for Mnangagwa, in an effort to consolidate power and extend his tenure, we saw in 2018, he was, went on a series of strategies to coup-proof of his, regime. And we know that many autocrats, especially those who come through military takeovers, they do embark on a series of strategies to make sure that another coup is not repeated. So when I say a coup-proofing, I think some scholars have said that these are measures taken by autocratic leaders to diminish the military's potential to orchestrate another coup. So since 2018, we saw, this series of strategies. Firstly, it was the systematic retirement and redeployment of several army generals. Some of them, they were deployed on diplomatic missions. We saw Sanyatwe being deployed in Tanzania. Some of them were deployed in government. We saw the late Brigadier General Sibusiso Sibanda assuming the Minister of the position of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and various other who were, deployed to various government roles. But more importantly, you also saw the demise of, many army generals who died either they were through accidents or through unclear circumstances. And much of those generals played a very pivotal role in the coup of 2017. And only last week, we saw a daring move by Mnangagwa, the retirement of the army commander Sanyatwe, and being redeployed to the Ministry of Sports. And we know that there have been, rumors, or should I say, there have been narratives that after the November 2017 coup, there was a gentleman's agreement between Emerson Mnangagwa and Constantino Chiwenga that Mnangagwa was going to serve for a single term and then Chiwenga would then take over. But however, we have seen the recent maneuvers by Emerson Mnangagwa that he seeks to succeed himself through the controversial 2030 agenda, which seeks to amend the constitutional provisions and extend his term limit beyond the 2 5-year terms. And I think that this is what triggered, the war veterans, especially led by key figures like Blessed Geza, to start advocating for Mnangagwa's ouster. So the 31st of March, initially perceived as an uprising, according to Geza, which then we saw that it didn't materialize, but instead Zimbabweans stayed away. Yesterday we then saw Geza climbing down, indicating that they are now pursuing the impeachment proceedings against Mnangagwa. And furthermore, he also made startling, allegations that the president's mental capacities are not functioning properly, and that the president is suffering from vascular dementia. Vascular dementia. I was just checking on Google on what kind of condition if one is diagnosed with vascular dementia, and I saw that it also results in the loss of memory, forgetting and stuff like that. So, and I think that Geza's statements yesterday, apart from revealing on the president's state of health, I think they also made very, very serious allegations, and that the president is entrapped into endorsing corrupt agreements that are primarily serving the interests of a few elites. He mentioned numerous times the name of Kudakwashe Tagwire as being one of the key figures in that. And Prof, you did pose some questions on the significance of the events that we saw on the 31st of March. And I think that it can be interpreted as follows. Firstly, I think that Zimbabweans staying away, it can be interpreted as a widespread protest against the prevailing regime, the economic hardships that Zimbabweans are facing, and a protest against President Mnangagwa's rule. Many Zimbabweans appear disillusioned, especially with the ZANU-PF succession politics. I think perhaps it's because they have learned lessons from the events of November 2017, Takamboitiswa, and they don't want to be manipulated anymore. So I think that this also resulted in them, staying away and letting ZANU-PF deal with its own internal issues. But some pertinent questions then arises: where do we locate the opposition in the development that are happening in our country? Recently, in a few days, I saw on Twitter Nelson Chamisa facing brickbats for his perceived inaction. But I must say that the current state of opposition politics in Zimbabwe is considerably in a dire state, following Chamisa's resignation from active politics in February last year, where he then relinquished control of his party. And I think that this predicament underscores a broader issue within the Zimbabwean political landscape, especially the pervasive reliance on individual leaders rather than robust institutional frameworks. And I think that an organized opposition, I think, could have catalyzed the impeachment process against Mnangagwa as suggested by Geza. But I think also we can safely say that Mnangagwa was preparing for this day, and he had navigated these challenges, the conflict division that he instigated in the opposition, the illegal recalls orchestrated by Sengezo Chabangwa, sponsored by ZANU-PF. But I must admit that an internal revolt that we are witnessing in ZANU-PF, if it was combined with an organized and unified opposition, it would have created serious challenges from Mnangagwa, as we saw in November 2017. But while many Zimbabweans opted to stay away, I think that the 31st is a significant day in that it marked the beginning of a protracted and contentious succession battle that I think will likely culminate into Mnangagwa's eventual downfall. It's not easy to remove a president, and what I saw on the 31st, I think it then marked the demise of Mnangagwa. Of course, Mnangagwa is going to mobilize his supporters. We've already seen that in an attempt to hang on, but I think that it may be rather too late. And also the speculation around Kudata Gwirei taking over from Mnangagwa, I think it's a fundamentally flawed narrative because we have seen that in Zimbabwe, the true power dynamics are dictated by the military, as also echoed by Chiwenga, last week when he said that they only take calculated risks. So I think ultimately, the ongoing power struggles within ZANU-PF, they present serious obstacles for national progress, development. The economy is at a standstill. And I think that that's crucial for SADC, to dispatch its panel of elders, especially to engage with President Mnangagwa, the military, the other stakeholders, so that at least we facilitate a robust and constructive dialogue that is aimed at, coming up with a clear path toward the stability and reforming our institutions so that we conduct fair elections. In conclusion, just a few 2 minutes, I think that now going back to the PVO bill, I think that the PVO bill, which is currently waiting the presidential signature, its purpose has been overtaken by events, because you know that for a fact, the government of Zimbabwe, when they introduced this bill, it was meant to curtail and to destabilize, the mobilizing capacity of civic society on the perception that civil society was aligned to the opposition. So I think that a series of events that I've highlighted earlier have significantly weakened civic society. I can talk of the implementation of the executive orders that were signed by Donald Trump that then resulted in the demobilization of civic society. Serious and many organizations currently, they are facing survival challenges. The mobilization to the capacity to mobilize has been diminished. Some organizations have sent their staff home. Some organizations have scaled down operations. And in some instances, others they've shut down. And I think that it is not in the regime's favor to implement such a draconian piece of legislation, this particular point in time, which would then attract, unnecessary attention for them, because civil society in itself does not pose an immediate threat, to the regime of Emerson Mnangagwa. And I think, in conclusion, I think what is needed for now, I think President Mnangagwa should reconsider his approach to the 2030 agenda, totally abandon it, because it's bad for the country, it's bad for the economy, but there's also a need for the citizens, to mobilize and defend the constitution. And additionally, I think, as I've alluded, that we really need a national dialogue and probably something like a transitional authority or an inclusive government with a specific mandate towards, coming up with a framework for reforms to address issues of national healing and the conduct of free and fair election. I think that will lead us to prosperity as a country. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Blessing. Okay, let's move to the next speaker, Tatienda. Just to remind you, each speaker will have 10 minutes, so please try and keep to a time frame. Over to you, Tatienda.
Thank you so much. I will try to keep well within 10 minutes. So for the presentation that I prepared, also had a youth outlook in terms of how the young people are experiencing the situation in the country. So I will start. The context in Zimbabwe has been improving time and again to match that of a hybrid regime, affecting the operations of not only civil society organizations, but also critics of the government of the day and the population at large. This has shamelessly been proven by the arrest of human rights activists in the lead up to the SADC summit, intensified crackdown and dismantling of fundamental freedoms, setting a dangerous tone for the SADC's commitment to human rights. We can see that Zimbabwe has seen a concerning decline in democratic freedoms. And even after 2017, we can see that Zimbabweans have been dealing with a changed ZANU-PF that no longer pretends to be a patriotic or nationalistic party, judging by the arrests of people and the speed at which national institutions and the economy are being destroyed amidst the self-enrichment of the military-led government. The rationale and the irrationale in the Mnangagwa regime belong to, and enable each other. Therefore, contributors to this collection can see contributors in this whole status quo continue to consolidate their power, and they continue to use phenomenon such as the Mbinga culture, where influential, wealthy people that have ill-gotten wealth are used to lure young people into supporting the political party. And this party is a party which works on a zero-sum game, which for them, the total winnings are for them and the total losses are for them as well. And they use the total losses to also dismantle and infiltrate the opposition. But not only the opposition, but also the civil society, which has for long played a watchdog role in terms of accountability towards the government. And we're also seeing that the party has changed into a culture of exceptionalism, where it thinks it is entitled to rule, and where other people's ideas or critiques are seen as a direct contradiction of the gains of the liberation struggle. But then we ask the question, what were the supposed gains of the liberation struggle, and have the young people been able to realize the gains of the liberation struggle? We also see the party posing itself as the state. So you find that when you get into state institutions, there's really a differentiation between ZANU-PF, the party, and ZANU-PF being the state. It is not an ordinary party. Is we see them parading. You can tell even around the time of Mugabe, there was a story around a miraculous event where prophets and God sent people had to ordain him and anoint him at a young age. So issues like these and the status quo like this makes the political, but also the social and economic context for young people very difficult for them, not only to participate, but also to raise their concerns and also to critique the party. In the months leading up to the 2024 SADC summit that was hosted by Zimbabwe, the government cracked down on activist organizations, human rights defenders, and pro-democracy activists. And around the time that the crackdowns happened, more than 160 people were arrested. Some were released on bail. Some are still on trial. And this is just a show of muscle, a show of power, where judicial and other state apparatus have been captured by the state, which in this case is ZANU-PF, and are being used as a tool of terror to terrorize the normal young person, the civilian, and as a way to show that if you act in ways that are not in accordance to how ZANU-PF would want you to act, you will face the violence. We can also see that in terms of the events that have been happening, this is something that is not new. We have seen consolidation of power, and history has taught us that when military men get into power, they consolidate the power for themselves. And they've been doing this through the PVO bill, the infiltration of the opposition party, and also of civil society. We can see that we do have a civil society that is rather on the quiet side when it comes to issues of activism and accountability, also because the civil society is being met by the heavy-handedness of the state. So again, it brings us to the question, what do we do? Do we sit down and accept the heavy-handedness of the state? Do we follow the cultist personalities that come and go, the fly-by-nights that promise us a better Zimbabwe? What do we do as young people, but also what do we do as the broader civil society? I think I will pause for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. And thank you for your thoughts on that. Let's move to the next speaker. Beloved Chiweshe. Beloved, over to you.
Thank you, Prof. Please confirm if I'm loud and clear.
Yes, you are.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking SALO for organizing this useful meeting at a critical juncture of our country's development. Also to thank our fellow speakers who have joined the panel and our chairperson, Professor Raftopoulos, for chairing this session. I want to put a few things on the table before I go into the substance of the presentation. I think the first one is that the Agenda 2030 issue is not as important as the dire socio-economic condition in which the country is. I think we should remember that we are discussing the agenda of the extension of the term of office of the president amid worsening socio-economic conditions in the country. That's one point. The second point is that within that dire socio-economic conditions, a new class of corrupt, politically linked persons has emerged and have accumulated significant wealth and have now tended to show off this wealth to civilians and citizens who are helpless and don't know how to deal with this elite crop of leaders. A third point is that at the current juncture, due to the worsening economic conditions, Zimbabweans are very desperate for a messiah. They are desperate for a solution. They are desperate for an answer. Hence, Geza's phenomenon could be addressing a part of that hunt for a solution. It may not necessarily show that people believe in Geza as a person. People believe in 31st movement as the answer, but they're just desperate. And if something appears on the horizon which seems to agitate them, they tend to run with it. More so in the era of social media. The third point will be around the fact that the culture of fear in this country is so bad that only those who have some foot inside the state or its apparatus or its tentacles have been bold enough to come forward and criticize the regime. There are so many actors within civil society, within the opposition, who would have come and made the same criticism which Geza did, I think with even greater vigor. But the state of fear, it makes it very difficult for anyone who could come. So I wanted to put these points on the table with regards to 2030. And the last point around the PVO bill, which is the new developments on the globe may make it very easy for the regime to sign the PVO bill. You recall that the winners of the German election actually went against the NGOs in Germany who were against them when they were campaigning. And in many other contexts, you see where either some groupings who have taken power going for either right-wingers or left-wingers, especially within civil society or their perception. So the current conditions make it very easy for the regime to sign if they wanted. They could make all sorts of claims. But I concur with Dr. Vava that there have been so many developments that make the PVO bill a very unnecessary measure to curtail civil society now. The reduced funding, especially towards democracy governance sector, which was their prime target for the PVO bill, makes it very unnecessary for them. However, these regimes also know that it's useful to have a tool in your toolkit which you can use when needed. So they may have a futuristic thinking that if we have the PVO bill as part of our laws, it can be useful to use them 5-10 years later to curtail the activities and governance of civil society organizations. So these were my key points which I wanted to make, which I thought, even if time runs out, I should have placed them on the table as part of the discussion that we're going to have. I will now go to the 21st National People's Conference in October in Bulawayo, where I would say two unconstitutional, as Prof. Rafti has mentioned at the start, resolutions were made. One being the extension of the term of office of the president, and the second one being the supremacy of the party over government. I think it is anomalous for a party, a ruling party for that matter, to go to a gathering of their members and leaders and make unconstitutional resolutions at their gathering. I think it doesn't make sense. Efforts should have been made, if it was the case, to put in place measures ahead, if it was to amend the constitution, so that the resolution you make are in line with the laws. You cannot deliberately make resolutions that are against the law. And then when asked, the Director of Information said, we will then look into how the modalities will be worked out. I think this is a key important issue. The second issue linked to that will be issue for national values. Many countries have got some values which bind the people together. If you look at the Harambe principle in Kenya, if you look at how the Ecuadorians revere nature and how they've put up a fight to ensure that mining and the oil conglomerates don't damage the environment. If you look at how the Greek people accepted refugees in their homes during the 2015-2016 crisis, based on their principle of accepting those who are in dire need of help. As Zimbabwe, if there's anything which should have brought us together at some point, it is the fact that we should not allow anyone to rule beyond the 2 terms. And if anyone was going to ask, why are Zimbabweans so particular about the 2 terms, we would have told them that based on Mugabe's 7 years as prime minister and 30 as president, a lesson that we have learned is that we cannot allow anyone to go beyond their term limits because of our experiences of the past. If you look at how vociferous Mutsvangwa, Mahia, Matema Danda were against Mugabe, you would not imagine that they would have a somersault today and start singing praise and endorse the 2030 agenda in light of what they were saying in 2030 as the reasons why Mugabe had to go. So we must agree at some point as people, as a country, that the 2 terms principle must be held sacrosanct. And we use Mugabe's term of office as an example of why we think that it's not a good idea. I think I'll end here, and then we'll take any questions during the second session of this dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks, beloved. Lily, can you put on my video? Thanks for that expression of your assessment of where we are now. I know that colleagues from Zimbabwe have connection problems, so they're not able to put on their videos, but perhaps Jethro, if you are able now to put on your video, and Gift, if you are able to as well after that, please do so. So let me hand over to Jethro. Over to you.
Thank you, Prof. Am I audible enough?
Yes, you are. Can you put your video on?
Let me see, Prof. If it's not going to take away the...
Yeah, only if it's not going to affect your connection. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I also want to express my gratitude for this recognition and this opportunity to participate in this very relevant and timeless conversation. Right, I think I will rush quickly into the meat of the matter so we economize on time and give a platform for questions and possible answers. Because we are at that moment in the history of Zimbabwe where there are strong historical and political questions that demand strong answers. It's quite a moment that we're in, and most of us might not be looking at it like that. We are watching as if watching a movie, but the country might go any direction now and to some disastrous and catastrophic consequences. And we hope it's not going to be like that. Right. What I tried to do here, Prof, was to look at literature, African literature, and what it can teach us about the moment that Zimbabwe is going through. And there are a few pieces that really, in my view, talk directly into the political and historical moment in which Zimbabwe is presently trapped. Very interesting was my relook at Abel Muzorewa's autobiography titled Rise Up and Walk, which is a publication of 1978. Muzorewa is one of those figures that we have not been allowed to think about, that we have not been allowed to legitimate. But the events in our up to now have forced some young people to go back and have a real look at Ndabaning's Tole and have a real look at Abel Muzorewa, the so-called sellouts, and what they could have offered this country. There's another real look at Joshua Nkomo as well, the potentialities and possibilities that could have materialized. Abel Muzorewa says in this book, Zimbabwe should be led by an individual who would not have to go to exile after that individual has exited power. The country should be led by an individual that will be able to walk in the streets of the towns of the country without fear of the people. But what has happened is that right from Robert Mugabe right up to the Mnangagwa regime present, not possibly live in the country after losing power. That would have to go to exile or cling to power till death for fear of the crimes they have committed, the national resources they have looted, the enemies they have created, and the anger that they have generated within the population of the country. So we may talk about what the regime has consolidated power to destroy the opposition and do everything to, out of the love for power that come with it, but out of fear of the consequences of losing power. We can say this and say that and say this and say that, but Emerson Mnangagwa is a terrified man who will not be able to live in Zimbabwe one day without the immunity that the presidential office gives him. Hence Agenda 2030, hence assassinations, hence eliminations, hence the buying of opposition figures and all that. The other piece of literature that I looked at and on the present moment is a nice little paper written by the late professors Masipula Stole and John Makumbe. It was published in 1997. It's titled Elections in Zimbabwe, the ZANU-PF Decline and its Incipient Decline. In that paper, there are two observations that ZANLA came from one-party state psychology, which political psychology was not going to brook any opposition from within and from without. And this one-party state psychology, the first homework that was done to approach a one-party state and to eliminate opposition from within and without culminated in the Kukuraundi genocide, which, over and above other causalties, was meant to eliminate ZAPU, Joshua Nkomo, and the supporters as opposition, as political opposition in the country. And that was achieved successfully when ZAPU capitulated in 1987 into a unity of convenience with ZANU-PF. So, Dr. Vava, the buying of opposition political figures, civil society figures, and the elimination of some of them, and elimination of some figures within the regime that were influential and were doing this and that, is all based on that one-party state political psychology of brooking no opposition, entertaining no dissenting voices. You buy them or you murder them or compromise them in one way or another. You know how Pius Ngube was compromised and how a religious figure, was it Shingi, somebody that was also compromised using personal, social. What was achieved at the end of this, the one-party state, was that the opposition was targeted. Certain figures were bought clearly. Some were eliminated. Others were frightened into hiding. And others compromised in one way or another. To the extent that we now look to political opposition within the ruling party and not without. So what ZANU-PF,
please.
thank you so much. What ZANU-PF effectively achieved was a party state, and a party state that is securocratic in nature. As we stand here, we await for the army, the military intelligence, the intelligence, and other characters within the security sector to deliver us from this quagmire. Quickly, I also looked at, Prof, I'm winding up.
Okay.
I also looked at one piece of literature by Professor Peter Eke of Nigeria. This paper was his inaugural lecture of 1975, where he wrote about colonialism and the two publics in Africa. What Professor Eke reflected on was that right there during the liberation struggle, the Africans that were leading African masses against colonial regimes were no longer liberators, but contesting colonialists that were jostling against the European and Western bourgeoisie to say, we are now educated, we are now armed, we are now trained, we can now rule our people, you can go back whence you came. So Prof. Eke observes that the figures that flew the flags at African independence, the independence of African countries, were no longer liberators, but other colonializers. And I choose to call these native colonizers because they are natives of these African countries. In every way, except skin color and nativity, the ZANU-PF regime that includes Mugabe's and Mnangagwa's, have acted economically, politically, and otherwise as a colonial establishment, where constitutions are overridden, the will of the people is sidelined, and cohesion takes the front seat. Quickly, let's try and look at the Geza phenomenon as the Babachukwa phenomenon. Every time there are going to be events in this country, there will be a figure, elderly, sounding wise, and saying certain prophetic and certain telling things that excite the population and awaken the region and the world to what is happening in the country. I want to look at Geza as a kind of Babachukwa. That is a front of certain forces that are lying quietly, waiting for some developments and all that. Lastly, Prof, ZANU-PF has taught us something, that to consolidate power, you work on.
Sorry, you're freezing up there, Jethro. We've lost you. Okay. You must be having problems with your connection. I think we'll come back to you in the discussion. I think you're having problems with your connection. So let's
Groupings and entities in the opposition.
Okay.
But in order to, it is within civil society. Okay. So there will be no paradiseal change. You're speaking me head
Yes,
still,
go
or
ahead.
I've lost. All right, finish up. This change is going to come, but it's going to be paradisal. It's not going to be beautiful. Working with the reformists inside the ruling regime and the deep securocratic state, and the opposite. There are reformists in the ruling party. I know it's quite an irritating observation to make, but they are there. This change that we wish for is going to be messy and clumsy, but it will involve enemies, opponents, speaking and agreeing that enough is enough. We now need to create a new establishment in Zimbabwe that is going to pilot us to change. And Zimbabwe is spoiled of national talents inside and outside the country. Sober individuals, calm individuals that can put this bloody, this dark native colonialism behind the country and drive the country towards some semblance of change to start with until we eventually get to change. Thank you once again for this opportunity to ventilate some of the views that I might have.
Thank you, Jethro, and thank you for the reference to the historical material available, which points to the long-term trajectory of the issues we're seeing today in Zimbabwe politics and generally in the post-colonial state. Let me hand over to our last speaker, Gift Ziba. Gift, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Prof.
Ah, good. I hope you can speak to some of the issues around the challenges in the opposition and maybe just expand on those challenges. Thank you.
Sure, Prof. Thank you very much. Let me ride on the already established protocol by previous speakers. I think that I've got 10 minutes to just delve into our view around the developments in the country, Prof, and fellow participants today. I think that in our view, we philosophize the Zimbabwean crisis from the fact that Zimbabwe suffers from a successive disputed cycle of disputed elections, a broken down social contract. That's how, for us in the democratic contingent, philosophize the crisis. It is born out of these successive disputed elections that have been in our country since 1980. All the elections that were held since 1980 in Zimbabwe to this very day have been subjected to illegal and political contestations, to the level and extent that our country is sharply divided. So there's no social contract, there's no trust. What you see on social media, on the streets of the different cities, both in the countryside and in the urban areas, is decay of trust. We have a contested state, the state that governs without the mandate of ordinary people. And the second crisis, in our respectful view, Prof and fellow listeners, is the issue of the role of the military, the state party military industrial complex, with the military playing a decisive power block in the Zimbabwean body politics since Gagao. So when we talk about the exit point from the crisis, is how do we, as Zimbabweans and progressive Democrats, cure Gagao? I'm going to expand on this point later. So these are the 2 points of how we philosophize the Zimbabwean crisis. A crisis of a broken down social contract, born out of the fact that the state is disputed and there is no trust, and it explains the divisions in the country, the divisions that start from family level to a community level up until the national body politic. There is sharp divisions and contradictions in our country. Mr. Mnangagwa has always been a fan of a one-party state. Since 1980, he has always been a fan of Zimbabwe being driven by absolute dynasty and the military cabal at the center of the politics in our country. Has always been an antithesis of multi-party democracy. That's why they invested so much in destroying ZAPU, and they've always invested in destroying authentic democratic movements in the country. When he assumed the power in 2017, his immediate thing was to have an opposition that they control. So this is the biggest crime that some of us within the Democratic contingent committed. The refusal to be co-opted, because Mnangagwa has always been preferring an opposition that they control, because he himself is not an electable character and individual, as it was demonstrated in his previous electoral participation in Kwekwe as a member of parliament. So that rejection of Mr. Mnangagwa has always been the reason why he's motivated around an opposition that is controlled. So the capture of the MDC alliance, post the 2018 election, the killing of civilians during the protest, when we pushed back on electoral fraud in 2018, and the consequent control of parliament and so forth. When we fought the CCC, we're not spared from this agenda. So Mnangagwa started with this attempt to consolidate power, amputate the constitution. So the immediate casualty of this whole agenda that we're seeing today was parliament. So the removal of members of parliament was a critical issue, because while ZANU-PF in 2023 had a quantitative majority, the CCC had a qualitative majority. So it became very essential for ZANU-PF to immediately assault parliament by removing members of parliament and then effectively removing councillors in the urban areas where the CCC had de facto and de jure became the government by controlling 32 out of 33 cities in the country. So that meant ZANU-PF in 2023, despite the election being rigged, being condemned world over, there were inroads that were made by the CCC. ZANU-PF had been reduced to be a rural party, effectively by the fact that we became a government in all the urban areas, and then had a qualitative majority in parliament. So the assault in the authentic opposition meant ZANU-PF began its path to consolidate its power. The civil society also became the immediate casualty. So you saw that the introduction of PVO bill, the capture and compromising of civil society to reduce it from civic and political issues to focusing on low-key issues like climate change and culture and arts and so forth. And all this also meant that the regime also moved on to capture and assault the labor movement in the country, because it targeted the different social bases. So the labor was targeted, the students' union was targeted by creating counter student movement. The opposition movement again obviously became the casualty. And Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF in the past 4 decades were investing in harvest of fear as a critical element in the Zimbabwean politics. So fear became the order of the day. Very few people became very open in criticizing the state and exposing corruption. So the opposition became also part and parcel of these institutions that were targeted, some being compromised, and some who refused to be compromised were then targeted either by being blackmailed or some being arrested, and fear being instilled on activists, and some people being forced to exile. Young people were also targeted because the regime was very thorough in terms of its attempt to ensure that there are not dissenting voices in Zimbabwe. People got compromised, money exchanged hands, and then harvest of fear became the order of the day. So I'll quickly go in the last 3 minutes on what the opposition now, and those of us that have remained authentic in the democratic trenches, believe it must be happening and what is happening. The first thing, there are 2 things that define the democratic contingent in our view at the present moment and going forward. The first one is making sure that we push back on authoritarian consolidation. To the best of our abilities, some of us have been involved in processes to ensure that we push back on authoritarian consolidation. That is our first and most important duty. In very limited ways, under difficult circumstances. Remember that we are effectively a banned organization in this country. The CCC was effectively taken over criminally so by the use of the judiciary, because it plays a critical role in authoritarian consolidation. But despite that, the party had been criminally taken over and the freedom to assembly being banned, we have been devising methods and ways to continue pushing back on authoritarian consolidation. If you look at the recent events in Harare, which case are called for, out of the people who were active in resisting and actively demonstrating against this regime, of the 107 people that have been arrested, 98 identify as members of the democratic contingent. That is the extent how we bear the brand of pushing back on authoritarian consolidation in the country in the best ways possible. So we continue to organize and continue to build from below. Number 2 is building a credible alternative. So that is the task that some of us believe is what must define the pathway going forward. Despite the challenges, the arrest, detention, most of us in the democratic contingent are in courts for one of frivolous political charges. All of those who identify and have remained authentic. But we believe that we must, outside pushing back on authoritarian consolidation, we must also create a credible alternative. So this has its own tenets and critical ingredients. Number 1 is uniting with all progressive forces in the country, taking stock of the state of the democratic contingent for the past 2 decades, to look at what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what must inform the character and content of the new political organization and movement that some of us will be part and parcel of, which consolidate the social base as was established in September 1999, and looking at the emerging social base that must constitute the authentic democratic opposition in the country. So that will entail uniting with the progressive forces in the country. And secondly, ensuring that we create very strong institutions. The assault on the CCC obviously taught some of us within the democratic opposition that you ought to create very strong institutions that must be able to resist the tyranny and all the challenges that we are facing. And thirdly, to locate the emerging social base in the country. What was the social base in 1999 has shifted fundamentally because of the high informalization of the economy. It means that the majority of the social base is now the informal sector. So looking at new ways of organizing and resisting dictatorship in our country will mean that the democratic contingent must be able to be reflecting in these moments while the events are happening, albeit in a very fast pace. We must be seized with the task of creating a credible alternative. And lastly, how do we exit from the crisis? Our respectful view as the democratic contingent is adding into the current debate about the transitional mechanism. We think that it is important to expand on the conversation about having a transitional mechanism so that we're able to jettison our country back into the road to legitimacy and a credible, free and fair election. That is how we locate the exit point from the crisis. So as events are happening, many want to locate where is the role of the opposition or the authentic democratic contingent, particularly led by Advocate Nelson Chamisa. Our respectful view is that we must be able to expand the conversation on the transitional mechanism as a vehicle and pathway. Obviously, that means that there must be discourse around its character and content, particularly around its roadmap to take Zimbabwe back into a credible election that is able to cure the crisis of division, the crisis of hate, the crisis of a lack of social contract in our country that is predominant across the entire body politics. So, Prof, I think that I've stolen another minute from my allocated 10 minutes, but I'm trying to summarize our view. Thank you very much, Prof, and listeners.
Thanks, Gift, for your insights there. I think you raised some important issues. Okay, listen, I won't comment at this stage. Let me open it up for questions and discussion. Anybody want to come in? Put your hand up, please, or just come into the discussion. Anybody have questions?
Just to let everybody know that if you want to raise your hand, there's a button that says react or reactions, and it's got a little heart shape. And if you press on that, that will show you where you can do the raising hands. And you can also indicate in the chat if you'd like to come in. And I think the chair has said that you can also unmute and let him know if you'd like to come in.
Okay, anybody want to come in at this stage? I don't see any hands.
Sorry, Prof. My
Josie, yeah, come in.
my hand is difficult to raise technologically, but thank you for that. I have a couple of inputs or questions rather to mainly the civil society colleagues, and of course one for Gift. One of the things that we see in the past few days or past few weeks, Blessing and Beloved, as well as Tatenda, has been the role of the opposition. What's happening in the opposition, comparison between the opposition and what Gezai has been doing, and the absence or the leadership style of those that are in opposition. But very little has been said about civil society. And I wanted to hear from you as civil society leaders in Zimbabwe. Practically, on the ground or in the boardrooms, what needs to be done by civil society to ensure that the solutions that come out are sustainable, but they are not just political solutions, because we know when eventually politicians sit and come up with an agreement, it is a political agreement. And civilian voices are usually not part of that. I wanted to hear how you characterize the state of civil society, but also what you are doing or what you think ought to be done by civics. That's I think that's a straightforward question.
Okay.
Then I have one for Gift, Prof. Sorry for taking more time.
No,
Gift,
it's fine.
in the run up to the 2018 election, and 2023 election. One of the key things that the opposition kept putting on the table and agitating, I remember Nelson Chamisa leading a massive, possibly one of the last massive demonstrations we saw in Zimbabwe. And in terms of what was being put on the table, it was an issue of reforms, that it was impossible practically to deliver a new Zimbabwe without particular reforms. In the past few months, since 2023 or so, that narrative seemed to have gone quiet. And I wanted to hear from you whether you still believe that for a new Zimbabwe to be birthed through an election process, we have to undergo certain reforms. If you can highlight some of the key of those reforms that you still believe need to happen, but also to hear where you locate that in your resistance matrix. What are you doing currently to ensure that the reform agenda remains on the forefront? Thank you so much, Prof.
Thanks, Mundwazi. Showers, I see your hand up.
Yes, Prof, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I'm just curious to hear from the panelists because, I mean, to some extent, the factional battles at the moment have been, of course, with the risk of being too simplistic, have been defined as one being a military faction, supposedly led and loyal to the vice president. And of course, Nangabo on the other hand, and maybe other elements of the securocracy. But my question is, given that at the moment, it seems for now that Mnangagwa has managed to sort of outmaneuver the military faction, assuming that he, at the end of the day, managed to consolidate his power and really outmaneuver that faction. What does that mean for the role of the military in Zimbabwean politics? Does that strengthen the hand of the military as has previously been the case, or does it weaken it? Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. I see Nasen Kolo. You want to come in?
Thank you, Prof. And am I audible enough?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. My question is directed to Comrade Gift Ostalo Sisiba. I think there's the need to answer what went wrong in the opposition in Zimbabwe in terms of managing internal conflicts and internal contradictions so that the opposition remains united. Right now, the opposition is fragmented and all key opposition figures are not doing anything, to the extent that people are now putting their hopes in a faction within ZANU-PF and the army. So it is a matter that, is it a matter that people are desperate for change and they are looking for a messiah or a liberator? But Che Guevara told us that there are no liberators, the people liberate themselves. So what is to be done in terms of conscientizing our people so that they can become their own liberators? Thank you.
Thank you, Nasen. Lily tells me that Yangerson Matete wants to come in. Yangerson, are you there?
Thank you, Prof. So I think my two questions, one will go to Dr. Mpov and Comrade Osalosi. So I'll start with Dr. Mpov. Dr. Mpov, on your ending remarks, you characterize the former liberational or nationalist as more of colonialist in your ending, that the liberators tend to mimic the colonizers. I did want to ask you to how do you also characterize the current opposition in Zimbabwe? Does it also mimic also the ruling party ZANU-PF? I wanted to know with regards to that. How do you characterize the current opposition party in Zimbabwe or parties in Zimbabwe? Then to Gift, you said on your first point that how you philosophize the current challenges in Zimbabwe is is number one, the continuous cycle of disputed elections. I did want to, on your own analysis, what do you think is the cause of the continuous cycle of disputed elections in Zimbabwe? Because also Dr. Mpov talked about something that he was quoting from the book of, I forget, but he was talking about the leader that is going to be able to walk free in the streets of Harare. So I did want to know that how do you think is the lead up to the continuous election dispute in Zimbabwe? Thank you.
Thanks, Yangerson. Okay, I think I'm just going to stop there for now because I want to give the speakers some chance to come in. Let me just summarize some of the issues that have come up. One, of course, is the challenges faced by civil society. We've noted the PVO bill, the threat of the bill, which in effect doesn't even have to be put into legal place because already it's in operation and there's so much fear and disability within the civil society. A global aspect, the USAID cuts and how this is affecting NGOs, and the rise of the global right, which is not really interested in democratization, more in consolidation of very narrow views of national belonging. The second is the kind of long-term historical perspective which Jethro raises. What are the implications of that? Thirdly, of course, is the current state of the opposition. And I think speakers have already spoken to that. They've already dealt in so many ways with that, but there may be some additional points. But more importantly, the questions raised for Gift about the state of the opposition and the need for critical appraisal. I mean, Gift, you're right to raise the issue of state repression and infiltration. But what you didn't talk to was the strategic mistakes made by the opposition itself historically. And they go back to the days of Tsvangirai, the split in 2005, which could have been avoided if certain measures had been taken. The transition after the passing of Morgan Tsvangirai, very untidy and in some ways unconstitutional transition. The strategic mistakes made in 2018 regarding how to deal with Parliament and how to consolidate what you had in Parliament and not walk away from it. And so it's not just a question of state repression. It's the internal strategic problems, the ethnic questions within the opposition. And I think you need to, the self-appraisal of the opposition is long overdue. We need a critical discussion about what has happened to the opposition, its own problems, lack of structures, the challenges of what's called strategic ambiguity, which people are still not clear about. And so this discussion really is long overdue, and I think we need to come to that. So let me come back to the speakers and say if they want to comment at this stage on some of the issues that have been raised. Let me start with Gift from the last speaker. Gift, you want to come in?
Thank you very much, Prof. I think that there's a question from Munjo. Thank you very much for Munjo for that question. I think that obviously there are deep-seated reforms in our country that are needed. There are minimum reforms. I think that in hindsight, I think that these include issues around media reforms, freedom of assembly, reform of ZEC. I think these are critical minimum reforms. When we went to the election in 2023, we drafted a document called the Pre-Election Pact on Reform, where we wrote extensively about what we were convinced that are critical reforms that ought to be achieved, so that in our respectful view, we can have an election that is acceptable by both political end, regardless of who becomes a victor in that election. And that's important because we're taking a new point of departure from our traditional approach as the democratic movement, that once there's agreement on this minimum reform, we are all tied to accept the outcome of the election, regardless of who becomes the victor in that election. So these minimum reforms to us remain very critical for Zimbabwe to resolve its crisis of a broken down a social contract. And then there was a question on what went wrong? I think it was asked by Nyson, if I'm not mistaken. But I think you indirectly answered that question yourself when you talk about the fact that Zimbabweans expect a messiah is what has poisoned our body politic in our respectful view. The big man syndrome, is, which came with Robert Mugabe, that Zimbabweans ought to subcontract, that as ordinary citizens, we ought to subcontract our victory in the hands of a few political elites. And with the rise in religion, does more harm into this discourse, as Karl Marx articulated as the opium of the oppressed. It does more harm in the rise of Pentecostalism in Zimbabwe and the African continent, makes ordinary people lose citizen agents. So I think that the investment by the democratic movement and progressive forces, I personally was raised by the International Socialist Organization, and I'm convinced without doubt that without a clear program of splitting a political consciousness, ordinary citizens will always subcontract their victory in the hands of individuals. And I personally, without speaking on behalf of the movement, I personally don't think that is a sustainable way to advance a struggle, because what has been destroyed in Zimbabwe is citizen agents. That's why Zimbabweans opted to stay away than to go to the streets on the 31st of March this year, because Zimbabweans are convinced that someone else must emerge from somewhere to liberate us. And I don't think that's a fundamental a point of any struggle, because what happens is that those who take power will also maintain it because they've given so much and it's not sustainable, and they are not going to be accountable even into the future, even in a democratic dispensation. And then Youngson asked a question around the disputed election. I think that Mnangagwa obviously wanted to create a competitive authoritarian regime, and Shegla answers that around the character of competitive authoritarian regime and the menu of manipulation. That election become held as a ritual without democracy, and therefore it cannot produce a transition, it cannot produce change. But because of the character and nature of the opposition movement, that it is a democratic party and not a terrorist movement or a social movement that intends to take power through unconstitutional means. So it is because of that reason why democratic movement like that led by Chamisa continues to participate in election regardless of the challenges. And I think that what must be done, that's why some of us are convinced around the framework of a transitional mechanism, because that will give a nation a pathway to achieve these key reforms that can take us back into the road to a credible election. And Prof's intervention answers what, in our respectful view, is what should be happening for the democratic opposition. I talked about two things. That on one hand, we must push back on authoritarian regime. And on the other hand, we must be seized with the task of creating a credible alternative. And I agree with you, Prof. Brian, that creating a credible alternative will start by critical analysis of the state of the opposition and appreciation of the challenges that have visited the opposition since its formation in 1999. And that critical appraisal, whether done publicly or privately, looks into the strategic mistake that the democratic contingent has faced since 1999. And this includes what you have articulated and what I also added around relooking into the social base in the present moment and what went wrong, because these are critical, particularly in the reality that President Chamisa and all the forces within the democratic contingent will obviously persist with forming a new political outfit. But that outfit cannot be formed without the critical appraisal of whether that is done publicly or it is done privately within the progressive forces. That is important. We are convinced, some of us, that cannot be, that a new movement cannot emerge without the critical appraisal of the MDC itself and its various formations since 1999 up until the period of the MDC alliance. The CCC itself and the experiments that visited the CCC, some of which that we've explained how we wanted to choose candidates, how we wanted to deal with the state itself, even issues around our policy intervention, the policy proposition, our position on land, our position on geopolitics, for example, on Palestine and others. So, summarily, I think that those
to wind up here. I need you to wind up now. Thank you. Thanks very much. I think those are important interventions. We'll come back to them. Let me go. Jethro, you can also just make a very brief intervention. You want to say anything in response? And just keep it brief, please. Jethro, are you there? Tatenda, I'll come to you when it's your chance. Hold on. Jethro,
Thank you, Prof. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, quickly. I think I'm speaking for many interlocutors and observers if I say anyone that talks of the continued shepherding of Zimbabweans to elections now and again, because elections in that country have become a regular ritual that serves to endorse rather than challenge ZANU-PF. That is because of the order of political things, the order of historical things in the country. So part of the reason why the opposition has lost its self-legitimacy and the trust of the publics in Zimbabwe is because of the preponderance on elections as a means towards political change, because it has not worked. It does not work, and it will not work until political infrastructures and superstructures change. So if someone comes up and persuades Zimbabwe to say, let's go for another election, it really sounds like ZANU-PF commissariat business, like to say, let's go once again and endorse the cult and all that. I'm sure colleagues in the civil society and in the opposition will understand what I'm saying and where I'm coming from with that. I've felt, Prof, that one of the reasons we have experienced a decline in the order of political things in Zimbabwe is the peripherization of political thinkers, researchers, intellectuals, and academics, which is what Mugabe did very well initially. Mugabe had respect for thinkers, policymakers, and other characters. If you remember his first deployments and delegations and all that, he had a lot of respect for intellectuals that bordered on fear. And that accounts for some of ZANU-PF's long-term successes against the opposition. What we're talking about here and what we've spoken about before, Zimbabwean intellectuals have projected these things. I regret to be the old-fashioned teacher today. There are two papers, one by Professor Gerald Mazarire on discipline and punishment in Zambia, 1964 to 1969. It's a paper of 2011. There's nothing we're talking about here that is not addressed in that paper. Another one is Professor Milestone on intelligence and the politics of Zimbabwe's presidential succession. That's 2016. There's nothing we have touched on today that is not reflected upon in that paper, and with some prophetic reflections for that matter. The question towards me was, you referred to ZANU-PF as native colonialists. What about the opposition? I think I said it almost clearly that the opposition have been compromised beyond repair That's why I'm saying right now to my colleague, Gift, that when you stand up in a platform like this and say the democratic contingent, the democratic forces, you really need to do a convincing of many Zimbabweans that
Sorry, you're freezing up, Jethro. Can you end your thing, please? Yeah.
democratic can still exist in the same sentence and all that. Mao, Chairman Mao, in the thickness of the disastrous cultural revolution, that there is great disorder under the heavens and the situation is excellent. So this crisis, Comrade Gift, can be an opportunity for reorganizing, rethinking, remobilizing, renaming, and self-correction, correcting mistakes of the past, and then looking forward to some possibilities. Because finally, one of the problems here is a problem of political culture. A certain dark, evil, and bloody political culture is setting in the opposition, in the civil society, and in the ruling regime. I hope I'm being heard.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jethro. Okay, let's move on to Beloved. Also, just a brief response to some of the issues raised. Beloved, are you still with us? Is Beloved there? Okay, I don't seem to. No? Okay, we can always come back to Beloved if he rejoins. Maybe he's having connection problems. Let's go to Tatenda. Tatenda, are you there? Yeah, come
Yes,
in.
I am. Confirm, Prof, I'm audible.
Yes, you are. Just a
Okay, thank
quick, brief
you.
intervention. Thank
I
you.
just wanted to. All right. I just wanted to say lastly, we can never dismantle ZANU by using its tools. This is feminism 101. You can't use the master's tools to dismantle his house. So as long as we are still rushing to elections as a way to change and challenge the status quo, we will be surprised that we'll continue probably for the next coming 10 years to cry out in terms of a stolen election, a rigged election. It's high time we start having the alternatives conversation in terms of how else can we ensure that there's pushback? How else can we ensure that the voices of all Zimbabweans are heard, but also how else can we re-engage if there's need to re-engage? How else can we push back? How else can we fight back? How else can we reorganize and mobilize ourselves? Because if we keep on using the same tools, if we keep on using the same strategies, we are still going to be faced with the same challenge. And then lastly, I think there was a question around civil society and what can it do. I think for me, the conversation there is very clear. Civil society is civil society. Civil society is not a political party. Civil society is not the government. It should stay clear in terms of its politics, its civic engagement, its civic awareness role. Civil society should provide the platforms for people to engage. Civil society should provide the spaces for people to converge and talk. Civil society should continue with its advocacy work. But as long as we have a civil society that acts as a political party, that acts as, a stage for people to advance their political careers, then we will have a compromised civil society that cannot stand up and speak against the social evils that we're seeing in this country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tatenda. I don't know, is Beloved back there? Is he back in the group? No? Okay. Well, let's move to Blessing. Blessing, over to you.
Thank you, Prof. I think that the questions directed to me were raised by Munjodzi, and I think I had done justice in the concluding remarks of my statement my presentation in terms of what civil society ought to do. I think that those who came up with the 2030 agenda have given us an opportunity for civil society to fight again, and a rallying mobilization point in that what we need to do is to defend the Constitution, it is to protect the Constitution, get mobilized. I think we need some kind of framework like the NCA as a basis or as a platform to mobilize citizens, those especially who are interested in protecting and defending the sanctity of the Constitution. I think in the absence of organized opposition, I think a people's movement that is anchored around constitutional reform or the defense of the Constitution can be that rallying point for citizens. Thank you.
Thanks, Blessing. Thank you for those responses. Maybe just let me come in with something that Gift raised about the changing socioeconomic structures in Zimbabwe and the effects, which many of us have written about. It was interesting for me to compare this stay away with what happened in the late 1990s. You remember in 1998, there was a massive stay away, which brought the country to a halt. It was preceded in 1997 by a general strike and 1996 by the public servants strike. So what was apparent then was these events were led by a strong and structured trade union movement and an emergent civil society with certain levels of autonomy. So there were structures being built and structures in place, and a strategy being thought about of building a long-term alternative narrative around the possibilities for Zimbabwe. What was different on the 31st, of course, was you didn't have these structures in place in civil society. We've seen the demise of the union movement as a result of the massive reconfiguration of Zimbabwe's social structure, namely the informalization of the economy, the attacks and the dismantling of civil society through legislation, loss of funding, the dismantling of the opposition through both repression, but also strategic mistakes. And so what we saw was not any clear structures in place pushing that, but people voluntarily staying out for various reasons. This raises the question, of course, which has been raised here: what is the future of any strategy attached to the Gaza strategy, without these alternative structures in place? Does it mean placing hopes on internal factionalism within ZANU-PF, which is a really problematic alternative? So we do come back to the question of how do we rethink alternative voices, alternative structures, alternative narratives in a current conjuncture, which was much more difficult than it was in the 1990s, not only nationally, but regionally, where in terms of SADC, Zimbabwe is not a priority. Much more priorities are the DRC, Mozambique. And so at the moment, especially with Mnangagwa as chair, Zimbabwe is not going to go onto the agenda in SADC, being led by any particular country. South Africa, ANC itself is facing its own crisis here and not wanting to take on any regional issues, already a problem, having problems in the DRC. Internationally, we have a global international leadership in terms of Trump, which is showing little democratic accountability, has a very right-wing agenda. We're seeing a tariff war in process. And the global right emerging in Europe as well. So the regional, national, global conditions are certainly not favorable. That doesn't mean, though, that we don't start with an assessment of where we are now and what needs to be done. Before we close off, are there any other comments from the floor which would like to come in at this stage before we close up? Anybody else want to come in? I don't see any hands. Lily, is there anybody I'm missing?
Not that I can see.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, let me then just have a closing remarks from SALO. Sorry, Nason, you want to come in for some final comment? Please do come in.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. I hear Comrade Ostalos talked about the alternative as led by President Chamisa. So I want to highlight on key important issues that were raised by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt in their book titled How Democracies Die. So they highlighted on key important issues in terms of dealing with authoritarianism, which is one, to build a strong, credible alternative or strong institutions, not strong personalities. Number two is to increase the cost of dictatorship, that is to confront the dictator head on. Number three is to isolate the dictator. Number four is to defend our zones of autonomy and protect our gains. So in line with this, I wanted to hear Comrade Ostalos' comments on Nelson Chamisa resigning from CCC, exposing it to ZANU-PF, leaving over 2 million people who voted and supported the CCC. Also his comments on Fadzai Mahere and Makam resigning from parliament without putting a fight to protect our gains. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think Othello as Ostalos has made his comments on various other issues. I don't know, Ostalos, do you want to come in very briefly on this?
Thanks, Prof. I think that I expanded on the issues around the issue of building a credible alternative, as my young brother quotes from Levitsky. And obviously, I think the questions around Chamisa's resignation can be a discussion. It's an evergreen subject, of course, but I think that there are many responses which we have offered around that. Summarily, I think that the CCC had been captured by the regime, so it's no longer a vehicle to take the democratic forces forward. It is as simple as that. So the resignation was not a choice, but the fact that the party had been criminally taken over. Fadzai and Makam resignations were clear. It stated in their resignation public positions that parliament is no longer a platform to advance the cause. So they were in their respectful was not going to guard, as he's quoting Levitsky. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Gift. Okay, well, I think now we have to bring this to a close. And thank you, first of all, to the speakers for really insightful presentations, raising many issues and challenges that the opposition, that civil society face in a current conjuncture, which is not going to be very supportive of alternative voices, but nevertheless needs to be dealt with. Also, thank you to all the participants for coming in, your questions, your comments, for a very rich discussion. I think you've really contributed to a way thinking about ways forward. Not going to be easy, but the first starts with critical thought and critical questions. So let me hand over to Ineka for some closing remarks. Over to you, Ineka.
Hi, I'm okay. Thank you so much, Brian, for chairing this meeting for us today. And I just want to extend a big thank you to all of our speakers and everyone who engaged in this fruitful discussion. We really appreciate everyone coming through today. And we just again want to thank our development partner, the Norwegian People's Aid, who makes these dialogues possible and makes it possible for us to continue this important work. Just an encouragement for everyone to please keep checking your emails for upcoming dialogues. We'll always be sending through our MailChimp for these public dialogues, and we encourage everyone to keep coming back so we can continue these important discussions. So from me and from the SALO team, thank you so much to everyone. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody. Bye.